to In the Footsteps of Politics, the show which aims to take the broadest view of politics and people's lives. We will talk to some of the most interesting people about how they got to where they are, their successes and their failures. We'll talk to politicians, activists, writers, artists and anyone with something of value to say. If they want to talk about their personal politics, they're absolutely welcome to, but in general it's a broader conversation, more interest in the intersection of politics and policy and where politics actually matters for the people. I'm Peter Newman, your podcast host. I've been a teacher, a journalist and a political candidate for over 20 years, and now I'm here to welcome you to go in the footsteps of politics.
Welcome to In the Footsteps of Politics, where I'm delighted to be joined by Professor John Curtice. Thank you ever so much for agreeing to come on and be interviewed.
Yes, you're welcome.
Thank you. So you've just finished a speech to the SNP and Yes Caithness branch. How do you feel it went?
Well, it was a good, invigorating discussion. Clearly, a number of people in the room quite recently, from their point of view, felt that perhaps they were fighting the battle about independence with one hand behind their back, and that it wasn't clear that there was any pathway by which they might be able to secure a referendum. Hopefully I may have given them some idea of what I frankly think are certainly crucial requirements. One is, first of all, to succeed in ensuring that there is still a pro-independence majority next year, because without that, there's no way it's going forward, because you won't be able to get the legislation through Hollywood. The second is to try and hope, but in the meantime, to try to do your best to try to engineer a hand parliament at Westminster in which the SNP might have the kind of leverage that might persuade a UK government. But then thirdly, and perhaps in some senses most importantly, that while support for independence is proving to be remarkably stable, it's running just under 50% in the opinion polls, and that the advent of a UK Labour government has not fundamentally changed that picture, it is still only around 50%. And that the Yes movement will be in a much stronger position if indeed we were looking at figures closer to 60%, partly because I think in those circumstances the Unionists would no longer be able to continue their current argument, which is essentially, you said back in 2014 this was a once-in-a-generation event, and that, therefore basically this is an illegitimate debate. Well, if it looks as though the Yes side are beginning to win the debate and moving the dial in their direction, then Unionists will find a pressure to begin to get involved in the debate, because they need to move the numbers back. And that then, once you've got the debate started, then you can begin to use that part as pressure, saying, well, hang on, but shouldn't we be settling this debate by referendum? But I still take the view that ultimately, probably the thing that will potentially unlock a referendum anytime soon is us ending up with a hung parliament at Westminster in which the SNP have an overall majority, and they're able to use that as leverage vis-à-vis UK government. But that leverage, again, will look stronger if it's clear that perhaps independence has become the settled will of Scotland in the same way as devolution undoubtedly has become the settled will by the time of the 1997 referendum.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I keep finding is that the SNP feel rather like, I've started describing it as Schrodinger's party, and then we're getting hit from the supporter side because we're not pushing far enough on independence, and then we're getting hit from the union side because we're a one-eyed party only fixated on independence, and therefore are being sort of frustratingly trapped in the middle. Mm-hmm. And I don't know whether there's an easy answer to that managerialism, but it feels to me like it comes back to a point you also made in the talk about, independence is rarely given. It often comes in blood, and one of the things that's been incredibly successful within the UK debate is that the SNP has always disavowed violence. It's always been, and so how does one break out of that sort of tension between trying to do it in a managerial fashion but also frustrating the supporters?
Well, I mean, I don't think that the Yes movement should be kowtowed by the arguments of their opponents, in the sense that they, well, from their own perspective, not unreasonably argue that we shouldn't be having this debate and you're too focused on the subject. But I mean, just think about it. The party that above all concentrates on the constitutional question is the Conservative Party, right? Okay. The vote on the unionist side is very heavily structured. No voters are, for the most part, now very, very reluctant to vote for the SNP or any of the other pro-yes parties. So I think you both need to and should be arguing the case for independence. I would just simply say that I think the case for independence needs fundamentally refreshing from 2014 because the world has moved on, not least because of Brexit, but also again, there are other developments that you have to be able to show that you can meet. And I don't think in truth that the SNP or more broadly the Yes movement have succeeded so far in the post-pandemic environment in getting the debate on independence started. And there were some attempts by the Scottish Government, but it's not really gone so far. Now, what I think is also true, however, that doesn't mean to say you just talk about this. I mean, clearly, particularly so far as persuading people to vote for you in elections is concerned, as opposed to referendums, you do need to be able to demonstrate a modicum of competence. And that there is a problem. I mean, in a sense, I think there isn't really a problem about independence other than that the SI could do with more supporters. But there is a problem about the SNP. The problem about the SNP is that there are a body of people out there who believe in independence who have come to doubt the competence of the SNP. And that really is a consequence of the post-Sturgeon environment, and by which I do not primarily mean Operation Branchform, although of course that has been an institutional problem for the SNP, particularly on the finance side. It is that Humza Yousaf was elected by a very narrow majority, even though the vast bulk of elected SNP parliamentarians who went public for Yousaf, but the doubts about Mr. Yousaf's competence that were known to be there were evidently clear to activists, and that many of them were still willing to vote for Kate Forbes, despite the whole row about her rather more socially conservative views. And in the end, he did indeed find it difficult to demonstrate the fleet of foot required to survive, and particularly made a mistake over the Greens. Now, John Swinney is, the SNP resorted to him, if that's the right word, and particularly, given we clearly went that far from an election, because at least he was a safe pair of hands, widely liked in the party, etc., etc. And I think, in fairness to him, he does come across now as somebody who is much more comfortable in his own skin than was the case 20 years ago when he was leader. Okay, frankly, it's one of the, there aren't many advantages to age, but one of the advantages of age is that you kind of learn to live with yourself, and you're no longer having to prove yourself to yourself, let alone to anybody else. You are what you are. But on the other hand, I think it's certainly a very good tactician. Clearly a much better tactician than Humza Yousaf, and particularly being able to wrong foot opponents in terms of day-to-day parliamentary politics. But the question mark still is that he doesn't have that big public profile. So he's somebody who people are comfortable with, but he's not necessarily somebody who enthuses. And at the end of the day, if you're going to move the dial on support for independence, you've got to get somebody who can get up there and there's intellectual homework to do, but once the intellectual homework has been done, to be able to craft that into a message or messages that will resonate with the wider public and be able to deliver them in a way that reaches them. And that's what I'm not quite sure that lies within John Swinney's skill set. One of the things about John, and again, give an illustration, John Swinney was brilliant as Deputy FM, because if you needed somebody to go on Good Morning Scotland when you were in a bit of political difficulty and you needed to fill 3 minutes with highly articulate, highly well-crafted answers that said absolutely nothing, John was your man, right? He's brilliant. You listen to him, hang on, what did he say? I'm not sure he said anything. But of course, as leader, you need a different skill. You need to be able to articulate an argument and crystallise it and project it. So it's a very, very different skill. But the question is, who is there within either the wider Yes movement or let alone within the SNP who has those skills or can develop those skills to provide that kind of charismatic, strategic leadership that might, as it were, change the political climate north of the border. Because in a sense, you've got a sense of a government that is, it's pretty wet out there, and it's trying to keep the umbrellas up. It isn't necessarily, obviously, trying to work out in which direction to blow the wind so that maybe the sun will come out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, by the way, Leslie Riddick tells a story of being on Good Morning Scotland as a host, having John Swinney, and at the end she said, "Oh, it was great, John." He said, "I didn't say anything today." And like look of panic across his face. So I think I think he would say that himself. I think I would argue, I suppose, the stability of the polling numbers suggests that he was actually the right man to stabilise at the time.
Yeah, they stabilised, but the point is that 33% is not good enough.
No, right, and that's this is if you're, as you say, if you need to get to 60 for an independence, then
but even 33% isn't good enough given that you have got 49% support for independence, and given that back in 2021 you were getting 85 to 90% of Yes supporters to vote for you. And you need to get much closer back to that kind of, because I think it's going to be very, very difficult for the SNP to gain the support of people who believe in the union. Now, the days when people were willing to vote for the SNP on the grounds that it was willing to stand up for Scotland vis-a-vis Westminster, those are over, because the constitutional question is now more important in the minds of voters. So therefore you've got to win back the existing Yes voters, but then yes, the bigger, longer term project is to actually get more Yes voters into your camp, but that's a longer term project.
Yeah, it's the positive vision, isn't it, beyond the stability. That's really interesting. So you've lived in Scotland now for...
When did we move? 1989.
89, so a good long while, 35 years, 36 years.
Yeah.
And how different does Scotland feel now compared to then?
Oh, yeah, we're going back to the days before. I arrived in Scotland not long after the second Glasgow Govan by-election that Jim Silas won, in the wake of which we did have the Scottish Constitutional Convention, because Labour came to the conclusion they did need to try for devolution the second time around. So I was around to see the Scottish Constitutional develop. I occasionally got roped in and to talk to various people, particularly about the electoral system for the Scottish Parliament, etc., etc. But remember, this was a world in which the Conservative Party was already significantly weakened in Scotland, although it didn't do so badly in 1992. But it was still running the show, and it was still talking about devolution to local government in Scotland, etc., etc., as the answer to devolution. You were talking about a Labour Party that, at least until after the ERM crisis and then Tony Blair becoming leader, did not have much in the way of self-confidence. And even then, why in the end did Labour pursue the Scottish Constitutional Convention and come to an agreement with the Democrats about an electoral system? Well, because they weren't convinced that they would have enough votes to be able to push devolution through the House of Commons, because they never ever believed that they could get a majority of 170 odd, right? So even then it was the product of perceived weakness. But of course it was also a world in which effectively the politics of Scotland were effectively determined on the plane from London to Glasgow or Edinburgh, or on the overnight sleeper. It's Labour and Liberal Democrat politicians talking to each other, coming to a fairly good understanding. Of course, remember we had the McLennan-Cook agreement. There was a wider agreement between the parties. And the expectation on both parties that maybe there might need to be a coalition between them. And that was certainly particularly the relations were being developed in Scotland. Where nobody anticipated that. Well, of course, arguably the kind of the crucial event, which again you see with hindsight, is the 1992 ERM crisis, Black Wednesday, because that destroyed the Conservative Party across the UK as a whole. But that's the moment at which the Conservative Party became the third party in Scotland, and the SNP became the second party for the first time since the 1970s. And I think one of the things one needs to understand about the Scottish Constitutional Convention, the assumption I think that underlay a lot of its work was that politics in Scotland would, like politics south of the border, would be primarily a battle between Labour and the Conservatives, with yes, Liberal Democrats perhaps a significant third party, and yes, probably the SNP playing some role, not least because it was going to system proportional representation, but they would still be the two big players. And of course, the intriguing thing is that by the time we got to the first Scottish Parliament election, people thought that the SNP did badly because they only came second, right? But of course, the other thing we discovered, although things have moved on since, is we also discovered that, and this is as well one of the ways in which devolution didn't work out the way it was expected. The point about devolution was to keep Scotland in the Union.
Yes,
right?
yes.
That was its objective. But of course, one of the things we discovered was that once you created a separate Scottish institution, people proved to be more willing to vote for the SNP for that institution than they ever had been for Westminster. Now that, post the independence referendum, that gap's got closed. So it's a very, very different world. It's a world in which you've kind of got a UK government that's Conservatives, and the Conservatives are running the show north of the border, although the Scottish office were often going on different tram lines than was the case south of the border, particularly in terms of what was going on with education. So you had a measure of a quite significant administrative devolution, but it was being run by the Tories because they'd won down south. You had this kind of nascent understanding between Labour and the Democrats was being developed about the kind of post-conservative Scotland they hoped to create, and how they would then be able to stabilise the Union. But in the end, none of it's turned out in the way that any of those players anticipated, and maybe, frankly, not really as either. Because we know that amongst the people who were most surprised by their success in 2011 was the SNP themselves.
Because I moved to Scotland in 1999, and I remember the SNP seemed a very minor party. There was a real belief amongst that Labour had set this up to keep them out forever. There would never be, And so I agree. I thought it was interesting. I'm surprised.
But by this stage, they were already the second party, and that is a product of the decline of the Conservatives.
Who were nowhere.
Yeah.
I was surprised downstairs when you got the question, should we be pursuing an SNP 1 and 2 strategy? But people seem to have forgotten that the only time we got a majority was with an SNP 1 and 2. He's right. The person asked the question pointed out the wasted votes, and statistically that's right. But as you said, you're then playing Russian roulette with the electoral system.
Maybe it won't. Maybe it won't. Right? Okay. It depends. You've got to be sufficiently confident in what you're going to do in the constituencies. And at the moment, with a 33% vote, even though you've got a 14-point lead, it doesn't need. The polls don't need to be that far off, and you find yourself in a different world.
Yeah, margin of error plus one bad day. So from your point of view, you've obviously you've been doing this a long time. You've been in the public eye for a long time. How do you? And yet, I never found anywhere where you've taken too much. Well, I suppose that's the question. Your personal politics have always been very closed. You've managed to avoid all of that, which I think is incredibly clever. Do you end up? Are you online? Do you get lots of abuse? Are you subject to these kind of storms of people?
I don't know, because I never read the replies.
Oh, really? So you don't. That's very.
Right. First rule of social media: you do not have to read the replies. Right. And there's a parody account about me. I don't follow it, right? Okay, you can ignore it. Beyond that, I have occasionally upset everybody, but fortunately, I think it seems to be the case that politicians on all sides seem to be willing to accept that while they may not always agree with me, and sometimes they feel like being unfair in one way or another, that I'm at least trying to be an honest broker.
Yeah, and has that
That's
been?
right, wrong.
Well, I think, I mean, but is that the way you see the role to be? Is it? You
No, it's not actually. I don't really regard myself as a broker. The way I would characterise the role is as a court jester. Okay? So the point about court jesters is that they have license to say the things that other people, the players, the king, the crown, the courtiers, do not have the right to say. Alright? So I have a license to be able to say things that may be uncomfortable, etc., etc. But the other crucial thing about the jester is the jester can be ignored. Alright? And you know, a number of times when I've said things and the politicians don't agree with me, you know, I can write many stories about. But that's fine. So I mean, so in the end, I suppose, what in a sense what people say to me they value is they value the fact that I try to explain things that are going on in ways that people understand. And I guess in a sense, what I am, why am I trying to do anything? I mean, apart from the fact that I mean, in part, it's the intellectual challenge of being able to understand what's going on and to be able to explain it to others, particularly, you know, elections in real time. But you know, it is also, I think that, I mean, in general, I take the view that academics are paid by the taxpayer. We therefore have a duty to use our skills and our expertise to, in a way that the public can gain access to our understanding, our knowledge, to do with whatever they will. But that certainly, given that you know, how we govern ourselves is a kind of pretty big question, yeah. Right? That therefore, insofar as one can help to explain to people what might be going on, and we had some of that this evening. I mean, clearly there were some members of the audience saying, look, this is a democratic outrage that we cannot hold a referendum off the back of Holiday. Well, that's not unreasonable, but it doesn't then answer the question, but okay, but how do you get to where you want to be? And what are the constraints and opportunities that face you? And what I'm therefore trying to do is to try to explain to people what I think is going on. So again, if you take a more recent example, you know, John Swinney's decision to hold a conference about the threat to Scottish values that came from reform. Okay, now I am sure the First Minister, it does genuinely believe that Nigel Farage would do Scotland a lot of damage. I don't doubt that. But it was very clever politics to open up this conference in which you therefore effectively posed to the unionist parties, so what do you think about reform, right? As a result of which the Labour Party found themselves having to say that we would not want Anna Sarwar to become First Minister off the back of reform votes, even though, of course, they cannot control that situation because we elect our First Minister, and you cannot stop reform voting for Anna Sarwar if that's what their MSPs were to decide to do. But equally, it also meant that the Tories in the end didn't turn up, and therefore you fragment the unionist coalition. Brilliant short-term politics, right? And the point is that what I was saying was, look, hang on, this is probably what he's up to here, right? And the point is he is playing the political game and using the opportunities that government create to be able to try and exploit the advantage. And that the brutal truth is that in exactly the same way that the reason why Labour have a majority of 174 is because of the rise of reform south of the border at the last election. That the reason that the SNP had the prospect of remaining in power in a way that did not look to be the case 12 months ago is because of the rise of reform north of the border. That is one of those uncomfortable truths that nobody inside the SNP will be willing to admit, but the court jester is willing to say, even in the SNP court.
That's a very, I think that's a lovely place to end. So John, you've been incredibly generous with your time. Thank you ever so much.
You're welcome. Nice to talk to you.
Cheers, thank you. Thank you for going in the footsteps of politics. I will join you again next time. Remember, democracy is decided by those who show up, which, as we were talking about earlier, tends to be quite a lot of people that could have swung the election. Many thanks.
That's all we have time for this week. Thank you for listening to In the Footsteps of Politics. You can email the show, footstepsofpolitics@gmail.com, or you can find us on Facebook by searching for Footsteps of Politics. If you've enjoyed the programme, please rate, review and subscribe wherever you get your pods, and you can find us on YouTube as well. In the Footsteps of Politics was written, hosted and produced by me, Peter Newman, and the music was Joyful Footsteps by Ukrainian producer Diamond Tunes, who you can find the links to in the show notes. Have a lovely week. We'll see you next time when we go in the footsteps of politics. And remember, politics is decided by those who show up.